Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Breeze Time with Kathy. Today we're going to continue your guided tour of the French Quarter as you and I sort of pretend that we get to spend a day, and I'm your tour guide in my hometown in the French Quarter, probably the most famous part of the city of New Orleans. Well, let us continue our tour of the French Quarter. Last week we had toured we'd come across on the ferry and we'd had some beignets, some French Quarter donuts and coffee at Café Du Monde on Jackson Square, and we'd wandered around Jackson Square and viewed the buildings there. Let's go ahead and leave Jackson Square. Let's take a carriage ride. I love carriage rides. I know it's so touristy, but walking or plain walking or riding in a carriage, that's the way to see the New Orleans French Quarter, in my opinion, and I really enjoy it. We'll continue on down Decatur Street. These buildings here are part of the old French Market. These would have had stalls with places that sold poultry or butchers or meat or fish, seafood, all these different shops here. And the fresh vegetables, though, and everything from the farm would be sold down at the French Market, what we call the French Market now. We'll pass this wonderful statue of Joan of Arc. New Orleans is a sister city to Orleans, and the nation of France, of course, we were a New Orleans colony a French colony for many years. So in fact, these are the flags here by Joan of Arc that fly over New Orleans. We have the French flag, which it was a French colony from the time it was founded in 1718 until it got transferred to the Spanish in 1763, and then it got transferred back to the French in 1803, and all the French citizens of New Orleans who had resented being Spanish subjects were elated, but that only lasted a couple of weeks because it was sold to the United States. And it was sold to the United States in part of the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. And of course, it's been belonged to the United States ever since then. This flag right here is the flag of Louisiana. It has the pelican on it. I love this statue of Joan of Arc. As I said, it was given to us. She was called the Maid of Orleans because she was inspired by God, she said, to lead the French army in the defense of France and in the king of that time. One of the Louis, I think it was. It's not uncommon, though, to see, look here, we've got Mardi Gras beads, both on the horse and hanging from her laurel wreath around Joan's head, Joan of Arc's head. Well, here's the French Market. This is the place where farmers brought their produce in from outside, in from the farms into New Orleans, and it would be sold. When I was a child, if you went early in the morning, you would see all the famous chefs of the city going through the market, picking out their vegetables to be served in the restaurant that day. There's less vegetables for sale these days, but there's still some fruits and vegetables there. A large part of the market, though, has been turned over to develop a flea market. The flea market is a wonderful place to roam around. I guess it's been there about 40 years or so. And it's a great place to roam around and make all kinds of purchases. They have almost anything you can think of, from trinkets to, some better quality things. While we're here, we'll visit my sister. This is my sister. Her name is Betsy, we call her. It's actually Elizabeth. And she makes jewelry. She's an artist and she makes jewelry. She's at times in her life had shops in the French Quarter where she sold her jewelry, but she started off in the flea market when she was in college selling her goods, and she found out after running a shop in the French Quarter for a while that the overhead was a nuisance, and the having to hire employees and was a headache, and that she did just as well working a stall here in the French market. So she has been a vendor there for, I think she says right now she's got the most seniority of almost any vendor in the French market. So we'll say hello to Betsy while she's there, while we're there. We'll continue on down around the corner. This is down on Ursuline Street, and of course it's named for this building, the Ursuline Convent. The Ursuline Convent is one of the oldest buildings in the Mississippi Valley. It was built in 1724 when the Ursuline nuns came to New Orleans. It's a French colonial building. There's not a whole lot of French colonial architecture in Louisiana because there was a terrible fire in the 1780s that destroyed two-thirds of, well, pretty much half of the buildings in New Orleans. But the Ursuline nuns came and they built a convent. My uncle did a lot of work on this convent. Remember, he was an architect and a historian, and I can remember visiting here when he was working on it for its restoration. He actually, in the 30s, when he had a Fulbright scholarship, he had traveled to Paris, where the archives of Paris had original drawings of all French colonial buildings, because when a building was planned, one set of plans, of course, were kept in the colony where it was being built, but the other set of plans had to be sent to the archives back in Paris. So he had studied there in the archives. As a matter of fact, he often joked that he could read 17th century French much better than he could read 18th century French much better than he could read the French newspaper of the day when he was there in the 30s. Well, one of the problems New Orleans had early on was it was a frontier city, and the men came without women, and the Catholic priests became worried that you can't, where are all the good Catholic families that are going to take root here and grow? And also a colony is hard to hold if you don't have families who live there and people who live there on a full-time basis. So they turned to the mayors of French port cities, and they said, oh yes, we'll be glad to send you women. And what they did was they emptied out their jails and their brothels, and they sent all these women of questionable character in the eyes of the Catholic priests over there to be wives. Well, they were totally unsuitable for wives in the opinions of the Catholic priests of New Orleans. So they petitioned King Louis XIV. And actually, Louis XIV started a program where he did it for other French colonies also. I think Quebec is one, where women who were poor but of good family, women from orphanages and women, that kind of thing, or any women who wanted to volunteer, as long as they were of good family, he would provide transportation to the colony. He would provide them with a dowry of some money, and also they would have he would also provide them with all the things that they would need to start their household, clothes and household linens and things like that. And each girl was given a box or a casket. This is a image from the New Orleans Wax Museum, which unfortunately doesn't exist anymore, but it was wonderful because it showed the history of New Orleans. And you see, these girls are casket girls arriving in New Orleans, and they have this casket or this piece of luggage, which in French was called a casket, and they were welcomed by the nuns, and they would be housed with the nuns, and with the nuns watching carefully. French bachelors were allowed to come and court them and marry them, and enter into marriage contracts with them. So there are many New Orleans Creole, the word Creole technically means in New Orleans that you were descended from the original French and Spanish. Now, many Creole people are also of mixed race, and because that was common, but even this man right here would have considered himself Creole French, though I doubt back in 1728, which is when the first casket girls arrived, he would have been a man of mixed race. However, New Orleans did have a large population of free people of color who were highly respected artisans and moved within their own society. Unfortunately, though, enslaved peoples became part of New Orleans almost from the beginning. And that, too, is just part of the tragic history of our nation. Now, on the edge of the Ursuline convent, they built a church that served not only the convent, but the people. And it's right here. That, too, has been restored. And in that is a rather famous statue in New Orleans. This is called Our Lady of Prompt Succor, Prompt, which means fast, prompt, and succor, Succor, which means help. And Our Lady of Prompt Succor was, this statue's famous because the Ursuline nuns, probably the most famous time that they prayed for the intercession of Our Lady of Prompt Succor, was in the Great Fire of 1788. Remember, I mentioned the fire? It burned a large section of the oldest part of New Orleans. It burned the cathedral, it burned the presbytere, it burned the part of the cabildo, and the fire spread within 2 blocks of the Ursuline convent. Let's see, which was located right about here, and the nuns credited the intercession of Our Lady of Prompt Succor. So it became, when help was needed and needed fast, a novena to Our Lady of Prompt Succor is something that many New Orleanians did and continued to do. As a matter of fact, they turned to Our Lady of Prompt Succor again, the nuns did, for the Battle of New Orleans, which took place in 1815. Actually, it's in January of 1815. Now, Andrew Jackson was sent to defend New Orleans. Remember, New Orleans had become an American possession back in 1803. But the city was very poorly defended. And in 1814, he was sent down to New Orleans because it was expected that the British would attack as part of the War of 1812. Indeed, he found the defenses of New Orleans in very poor condition. He recruited as many people as he could. As a matter of fact, he even recruited pirates and privateers like Jean Lafitte and his men to help in the battle. When the battle finally happened, it took place in early January 1815. He faced thousands. He was greatly outnumbered by the British, and led by General Packenham, who was killed at this battle. But they did prevail, and Jackson became known as the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. Tragically, a peace treaty had been signed in France just a few weeks before, but because of the slowness of communication, neither the Americans nor the British knew that the war had already ended. And this battle was fought about 3 weeks after the war ended, which is really sad to think of the number of people who died in a battle that, if communication had been better, never would have been fought. Well, now you're going to have to forgive me because I was raised on Louisiana architecture. I often spent time with my uncle. So I'm going to talk about the architecture of this building. This building is a typical Creole cottage in the French Quarter. They are simple houses with dormers and just a wonderful Creole cottage. There are many of them in the French Quarter, and this is a marvelous example. And they were pretty much where the working upper, the merchant class might live if they weren't very, very wealthy. Just the middle, low, the working class and the upper middle, the middle class might live here. The upper classes lived in much larger houses, of course. This is one style. Here, this was the home originally of General General P.T. Beauregard, who was a Confederate general from Louisiana. He was a Creole Frenchman, and but the house was later owned by Frances Parkinson Kives, who was a fairly well-known author in her days. Her most famous book was Dinner at Antoine's. She bought the house, she lived there, and she restored it. And actually, my uncle was the architect for the restoration. So I'd been in the house several times and met Miss Kives, and it was really pretty interesting. But this style basically is what we call a raised cottage, because the house is raised and the living quarter is on the second floor. The reason is it was better to catch the breezes up that high and be above the squalor of the city. If you notice, houses in the French Quarter are built right on the street. And you think, well, where are the gardens? Well, the gardens are patios, such as this one right here for the Beauregard house. And it sits there. And this is sort of what a typical French Quarter patio looks like. It has a fountain, and they're hidden away, and you get to look. It's always fun to catch a glimpse at a beautiful patio. They were secluded and away from the noise and the dirt of the streets. Now, as we ride along, remember we're riding in our carriage, I'd like to point out the differences in our beautiful ironwork on our balconies. This particular balcony has some exquisite cast iron. Cast iron, because it is cast in a mold, is able to have this lacy, beautiful appearance. And whereas wrought iron is straight pieces of iron that are bent and curved into shapes, that's an older version of iron, older way to work the iron, and still endures today. And it too has its own beauty. Here's another of these famous cast iron balconies. Oh, look, we're passing Galatoire's. Galatoire's is a rather famous restaurant in New Orleans. It was founded in 1904, and one of the little, it was a 5-star restaurant. I don't know if it still has a 5-star rating, but when I lived there, it was one of the couple 2 or 3 5-star restaurants in New Orleans. The thing was, they didn't take reservations. It's very interesting. Everybody stood on the street, and everybody stood in line in order to get into Galatoire's. Now, I understand that they opened some additional dining rooms in recent years, and you can get reservations up on the second floor. But and I don't know what they're doing since COVID, but everybody, politicians, everyone. One of our state senators, Bennett Johnston, was standing in line, and he got a call from the president. So he had his aide stand in line for him, and then he went and spoke to the president and got back in line. It's really quite interesting. There's all kinds of places that have these little. Well, this is the ground floor dining room and the oldest dining room at Galatoire's. I'm told it looks pretty much the same as it did back in 1904. And the reason I know that is because we had a wonderful friend of ours who remembers, her name was Sue Himes, and her uncle at the time was governor of New Orleans. And so she had dined at Galatoire's many times, even from the time she was a child. She remembers sitting under the tables and looking at the mosaic tile, the green and white tile that's still there. She continued to go to Galatoire's once or twice a week for the rest of her life, and she was one of the few. She was the only person known to have a charge account at Galatoire's. That she would simply send her. They would simply send her a bill. As a matter of fact, one day My mother and I were with Sue and we were going to Galatoire's to eat. And as we were coming down the street, we're about a block away, where we had parked in a parking garage. And a gentleman in a suit walks up to her and says, "Miss Himes, are you going to dine today?" And she said, "Well, yes, I am." And he escorted us right in. And surprisingly, we cut the line, which gave us a lot of people were staring at us. I never heard of anyone cutting the line at Galatoire's, but in we went, and he said, "Well, Miss Himes, I see your regular table is occupied. Would this table do?" He points to it, and she goes, "Oh, yes, that'll be fine." And so we go and we sit down on the table, and he said, "I'll be right back." And he went and he disappeared, and he changed, and he's now not wearing a suit, but he's dressed as a waiter. With his bow tie and such, and I realized, and afterwards Sue told us, "Oh, he's my waiter. He always takes care of me when I come," and so that's why he stopped me, and he wanted to help me. I never heard of such a thing. A man who's off duty has already gotten off work, goes back to work because he sees one of his longtime customers coming in, headed to go eat. And that's what he did. Sue was a remarkable person. She really was a joy to know. But we don't want to stand in line to get lunch, so why don't we head on over to the Acme Oyster House. They are famous for serving oysters on the half shell and other kinds of seafood. We won't have to wait that long, and we can have some really good food. It's kind of a typical restaurant, but we'll get something good. And my favorite, of course, well, my mother's with us, we'll have to get oysters on the half shell. She loves raw oysters. I like them too. I don't die for them. Every once in a while, my mother, even to the time she was in a nursing home, would have a craving for raw oysters. So we'd have to get her a few raw oysters on the half shell, and she could enjoy them. But what I really want is what Acme Oyster House is famous for. The best oyster po' boys in town. Oh, I love oyster po' boys. Now, the bread that we use for po' boys is called New Orleans French bread. It has the crust right here is very crisp, but the bread inside is very tender. And it comes in long loaves, about 2 feet long, I suppose, if not longer, maybe 3 feet long. And I can remember as a child, when I was in high school and I would ride the streetcar to school, we would be waiting at the streetcar stop, and there was a Williams grocery store, a small corner grocery store in the city, and they would get their bread delivered. It would be delivered in a big brown paper bag with all these loaves of French bread sticking up, and just smelled so wonderful. It was the same French bread that they use here. And I just haven't, though they call it French bread up here, it's just not quite the same. And so I don't think you can really make a good po' boy because you can't get the bread up here. But it is really, really wonderful. The reason they're called po' boys is because during the Depression, or maybe earlier than that, actually I think it was before the Depression, back in the 1800s, one of the ways that pubs would attract people for lunch, and bars would in order to keep up their business, they would have specials on sandwiches, a different sandwich every day, and it would be called a po' boy sandwich because it could be bought for just for a nickel or less, and along with something to drink. And that's the way they would get people into the bars during the workday and supplement their income. So you can fill a po' boy. This is an oyster po' boy, but the shrimp po' boys are very popular. My mother always likes to get half and half shrimp, one half is shrimp and one half is oyster, because she couldn't make up her mind. But roast beef po' boys are particularly good, and they're dripping with gravy and are very messy to eat. But it's a good lunch, and why don't we go ahead and have a drink and have have some po' boys for lunch, and we'll continue our journey next week. Well, I hope you enjoyed our tour, and I look forward to sharing more stories with you about places I've visited or things that occur to me. I'm so glad that you joined me for Breeze Time. And until next time, may God bless you and keep you.